My name is Julia Tran. I'm 27 years old living in Sacramento, California. I work as a fifth grade teacher at a public elementary school in the city. Modest pay, long hours, but it's a job I love. My husband Dylan is a mechanic. He runs his own small garage on the edge of town, specializing in old trucks and vintage rebuilds. We live in a one-bedroom rental behind a peach-colored duplex, and we're just trying. Trying to build a life, trying to stay afloat, trying to be happy. Neither of us came from money. I was raised in a working-class Vietnamese-American family, first generation, born in the U.S. My parents, Mom was a seamstress. Dad worked maintenance for a college, climbed their way up through sheer grit, and I admired them for that. But somewhere along the way, their pride calcified into something colder expectations. I could never meet love that had to be earned, not given. My brother Brandon, on the other hand, never had to earn it. He was the baby, the charmer, the golden boy. My parents practically lit candles for him when he walked into a room. I was the one who cooked dinner when Mom worked nights. I got straight A's, never talked back, put myself through college with scholarships and 2 part-time jobs. But none of that seemed to matter. They used to say, "Brandon just needs a little more help, Julia. You're strong. He's still figuring things out." That was the family motto. You're strong. He needs help. Translation: we'll drain ourselves for him. You'll be fine. Brandon dropped out of college his sophomore year and spent 2 years drifting bartending in LA, getting into minor trouble, leaning on our parents for rent money and car repairs. Then one day, he brought home Vanessa, his fiancée, a stunning woman with a dazzling smile and a doctorate in dental surgery. She was everything my parents dreamed of in a daughter-in-law: educated, polished, prestigious. They went all in for Brandon's wedding, $25,000. That's how much they gave him just for the wedding fund. I know because I overheard them bragging about it at a family barbecue. It's an investment my dad said to an uncle he's marrying up. They also threw in a luxury honeymoon in Italy. Oh, and a Rolex. For Brandon, a wedding keepsake, they said. I helped Vanessa pick out flowers one afternoon, and she joked, "You're going to be next. I hope they spoil you just as much." I smiled and changed the subject. I already knew the answer. Fast forward a year. I told my parents I was engaged. Their reaction: silence, followed by to who they'd met Dylan 3 times before that. Once at a Lunar New Year party, twice at family dinners. He was always respectful, quiet, even shy, but kind, thoughtful. He fixed my mom's dishwasher once without being asked. He gave my dad a ride when his car broke down. But he didn't have a degree. He didn't come from a nice family. And worst of all, he wasn't Brandon. When I called to share the news, my mom paused and said, well, I guess you've made up your mind. No excitement, no congratulations. Dylan proposed with a tiny sapphire ring he saved up for over 6 months. He planned the whole thing, took me to a picnic at the same park where we had our first date. I cried when I said yes. Not because of the ring or the view, but because he looked at me like I was already enough. I hadn't felt that in a long, long time. We planned the wedding ourselves. Budget $7,000. I picked up extra tutoring hours on weekends. Dylan started working nights. We cut corners everywhere we could. I found my dress secondhand online. We asked a friend to take photos. My students helped make paper flower centerpieces as a craft project. I was okay with all of it. I just wanted the people I loved to show up. My parents didn't. They RSVP'd maybe for months. Then 3 weeks before the date, they called and said, "We're not coming. It doesn't feel right to support this. We think you're rushing." I didn't cry when they said it. I just nodded, even though they couldn't see me over the phone. But the morning of the wedding, when I saw that text, "Don't expect a gift," that's when something broke. It wasn't about the money. Not really. I didn't want their gift. I wanted their presence, their approval. I wanted to be wanted. I wanted them to say, "You deserve happiness too, Julia." Instead, they reminded me one last time, "You're the strong one. You'll be fine without us." I put my phone face down on the counter and sat down staring at the floor tiles. Dylan came in from the garage a few minutes later, his hands still smelling faintly of motor oil. He saw my face and didn't ask anything. He just sat beside me and held my hand. We stayed that way for a while. "I think I'm okay," I whispered more to myself than him. Dylan kissed my knuckles. You don't have to be okay right now. Just let me be here. And he was, that day and every day since. I walked myself down the aisle. No music, no fancy church. Just me and a patch of wild grass behind our friend's farmhouse where we held a tiny ceremony. Dylan cried before I even reached him, and somehow that made the whole thing beautiful. I didn't need a Rolex. I didn't need a 5-tier cake. I just needed to remember I am enough. But if I said that was the end of it, I'd be lying. The bitterness came later, after the wedding, after the dust settled. Growing up in Elk Grove just south of Sacramento, our family lived in a modest 2-story house with beige siding and a cracked driveway that my dad always said he'd fix next summer. My parents came to the U.S. from Vietnam in the early 80s with nothing but 2 suitcases and the names of distant relatives in San Jose. By the time I was born, they'd scraped together enough to buy a small homework full-time and provide for us. I used to think we were lucky, and in many ways we were. But luck came with conditions in our household expectations that clung to me like a second skin. From as early as I can remember, I knew my role the helper, the one who set the table, who translated bills and doctor's appointments into English for my mom, who stayed up late with flashcards because Dad said, "You're our hope, Julia." Brandon was born 3 years after me, and the rules for him were different. From the start, he was given more freedom, more leniency, more grace. I don't think it was malicious. In fact, I believe my parents truly loved us both. But their love was imbalanced, and I bore the weight of it without fully understanding what it meant until much later. In school, I was the overachiever. I got straight A's, joined student council, helped raise money for the marching band. Brandon coasted through. If he got a B, it was cause for celebration. If I got a B+, my mom would ask, "Why not an A?" I remember one summer when I was 15 and Brandon was 12. He got caught shoplifting a pair of video games from a department store. My parents drove him home in a fury, but that night while I pretended to sleep, I heard them talking. "He's still young," my mom whispered. "It's hard being a boy in this country," my dad replied. "Let's not be too hard on him." Meanwhile, I had once been grounded for a week for coming home 15 minutes late from the library. Still, I kept my head down. I worked. I saved. I followed every rule. I wasn't trying to compete. I just wanted to make them proud. After high school, I got into UC Davis on a full academic scholarship. My parents barely attended my orientation. They were busy helping Brandon prepare for his SATs, which he would eventually flunk twice. I didn't resent him then, not really. He was still my brother. I told myself he'd find his path in his own way in his own time. But time passed, and nothing changed. While I worked summer jobs and took 18-unit semesters, Brandon bounced around from community college to bartending gigs to a pyramid scheme that nearly cost my parents thousands. Every time he stumbled, they picked him up. They paid his rent, bought him a used car, gave him everything they never gave me, and never explained why. I didn't question it out loud. That wasn't the kind of daughter I was allowed to be. I just smiled through it, bit down on my pride, and told myself it's fine. Be the bigger person. You're strong, remember. But the gap kept growing. When I graduated college, I bought my own cap and gown because my parents said they couldn't afford the $80 rental. A month later, Brandon got into a minor car accident and they wrote him a $1 $200 check to help out. When I got hired at my first teaching job, I brought home a bottle of sparkling cider to celebrate. My mom asked if I was going to start dressing more professional now that I was a real adult. When Brandon landed a job as a sales rep at a car dealership, they threw him a barbecue, bought him a new briefcase, and called every aunt and uncle to announce the news. I learned how to make space for myself in the silence. In college, I found refuge in books, late-night walks, the friendships I built without needing to explain where I came from. I dated a few kind men, but I never brought them home. What was the point? Then at 25, I met Dylan. He came into the school parking lot on a rainy Wednesday morning, towing his niece's broken-down Corolla. I was standing under an umbrella waiting for the bell when he offered me a smile and asked if I wanted to step inside his truck to stay dry. I declined politely. Then I saw the little girl in the back seat, her hair in braids and tears on her cheeks. She was one of my students. He was her uncle. She lived with him. Her mom had passed away the year before. Something shifted that day. I didn't know it yet, but a door had opened. We talked. First about his niece, then about books and favorite foods, and how both of us used to think we'd end up in bigger cities with bigger dreams, but somehow life anchored us here. He had calloused hands and a gentle heart. He remembered things I said weeks later. He listened. He made me laugh in a way that made my chest ache from how unfamiliar it felt. I fell hard, quietly, deeply, all at once. When I introduced him to my parents 6 months later, I had hope. I thought maybe they'd see what I saw, a man with integrity, loyalty, and love. But they greeted him with stiff smiles, asked a few cold questions about his career, then spent the evening talking over him. On the drive home, I apologized. He shrugged. It's okay. They don't have to like me. But I wanted them to. I needed them to. When we got engaged, I thought maybe they'd finally understand. Instead, they pulled away further. With every choice we made, modest ceremony, backyard venue, thrifted decor, they judged. My mom said I was embarrassing the family. My dad said I was settling, but I wasn't settling. I was choosing peace over performance, love over approval. And in doing so, I was about to set fire to every lie I'd ever believed about what it meant to be the good daughter. After Dylan proposed, I waited 3 days before telling my parents. It wasn't because I wasn't excited. I was. In that quiet, overwhelming way that wraps around your ribs and makes your heart beat in your throat. He had planned everything with such care, a private picnic at William Land Park, the same spot where we had our second date. He'd packed banh mi from our favorite corner deli, brought a blanket we'd used a dozen times before, and tucked the ring into a little velvet pouch inside a mason jar of dried wildflowers. When he pulled it out, his hands trembled, his voice cracked, and I said yes through happy tears. 3 days later, I stood in my kitchen rehearsing what I'd say to my mom. I didn't want to call because I knew what a phone call could do. She'd interrupt, deflect, change the subject. I decided to text. Mom, Dylan proposed. I said yes. We're getting married next spring. I stared at the message for a long time before I hit send. The typing dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, her reply came. You should take some time to think about this. No congratulations, no emoji. Just an unsolicited warning. I waited 5 minutes before replying, I have. We love each other. We're ready. Her response came instantly this time. Love isn't enough. You're rushing. Don't say we didn't warn you. No, we're happy for you. No, we'd love to meet with Dylan's family, not even when's the date. I didn't reply after that. The next day, my dad called me. His voice was measured, emotionless. Julia, do you know how this looks to people? You're a teacher. He works on cars. How are you going to support each other when you have children? I had heard this before. That deep, cutting judgment masked as concern. He always spoke in logic, as if love was a math problem he could solve with a salary sheet. I told him quietly, we'll figure it out. We're not asking for money, Dad. His pause was sharp, and then came the final cut. Good, because you won't get any. That night I cried into Dylan's chest, the first of many tears I would shed during our engagement. He didn't say much, just wrapped his arms around me tighter and whispered, They don't see you the way I do. That's on them, not you. We set the wedding date anyway. April 22nd. A spring wedding under the tall cottonwood trees on Dylan's aunt's land just outside of Folsom. She offered it to us for free, said it hadn't been used since her own wedding 30 years ago and was just waiting for another love story. We chose simple decorations, string lights, borrowed from a friend mason jar vases filled with seasonal flowers, and handmade paper cranes folded by my students. Every detail had our fingerprints on it. Every decision felt like ours alone. But the further we got into planning, the more obvious the contrast became. When Brandon and Vanessa got engaged, my parents hosted a family dinner with 30 guests to celebrate. They gave a starter fund of $10,000 within 2 weeks. My mom took Vanessa dress shopping in San Francisco. My dad offered to pay for the venue before they even picked one. And now, 1 year later, their daughter, their firstborn, was marrying a man they didn't approve of, and they treated it like a quiet shame. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. That love would be enough to carry me through. That approval didn't pay the bills, that I didn't need their praise, just peace. But that was a lie. I wanted my mom to cry when I tried on my wedding dress. I wanted my dad to offer to walk me down the aisle. I wanted a text that said, "We're proud of you." Instead, I got silence. Radio silence from January to March. Not a word. Not a question. Not even a check-in. Until the bridal shower. My best friend Anna threw it in her backyard. It was sweet and warm and full of laughter women who loved me just as I was. But there was an empty seat where my mom was supposed to be. I had invited her anyway. Maybe part of me still hoped. She never responded. But she sent a message that night, hoped the party was nice. Don't expect us at the wedding. The word us hit harder than I expected. I never thought my dad would actually stay home. But he did. Even Brandon didn't call. And I started to wonder, had I done something wrong? Had I failed them somehow? Was loving someone they didn't choose for me really? Was loving someone they didn't choose for me really such a betrayal? I kept asking myself that over and over. I replayed every conversation I'd ever had with my parents, looking for the exact moment they began to see me not as their daughter, but as a disappointment. I scrolled through years of texts, birthday messages that were never personal, only obligatory. Happy birthday, study hard. Congrats on the new job. Keep working. No warmth, no softness, only duty. And yet, despite it all, a part of me still believed they'd change their minds. I imagined them showing up on the day of the wedding just as the music started, dressed in something understated but formal. My mom would hug me, her eyes misty, and whisper, "I'm sorry. I was wrong." My dad would take my arm and say, "Let's go get you married." But that fantasy shattered for good on the day I saw Brandon. It was 2 weeks before the wedding, and I ran into him at the grocery store. He was standing by the frozen foods aisle, looking down at his phone, wearing a button-up shirt and holding a basket full of protein shakes and frozen dumplings. I almost walked the other way, but he looked up and spotted me before I could. "Julia," he said, his face caught somewhere between surprise and guilt. "Hey," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. We hadn't spoken in over 3 months, not since I texted him a wedding invitation and he never replied. I waited for him to say anything, but he shifted awkwardly and muttered, "How's it going?" "We're fine." "Busy," I said. Then I added, "Wedding's in 2 weeks." He nodded. "Yeah, I heard." I waited again. For a congratulations. For a sorry I didn't RSVP. For a Vanessa and I are coming. But nothing came. Just silence. Finally, I asked, "You and Vanessa, are you coming?" He cleared his throat and looked away. "I don't think so. Mom said it's not a good idea." I blinked. "Mom said it's not a good idea. You're a grown man, Brandon." He frowned, defensive now. "It's not that simple, Jules. You know how they feel. They think you're making a mistake." "Do you think I'm making a mistake?" He hesitated. That hesitation was enough. "Wow!" I whispered, the anger blooming hot in my chest. "You got 25 grand and a Rolex for your wedding. I didn't even get a card, and you're going to stand there and tell me it's not that simple." "Don't do this here," he muttered, eyes darting around like we were about to make a scene. "Why not?" I snapped. "It's the only place you'll actually talk to me." "Julia, come on, no. You had every chance to support me, to show up, to be a brother, and instead, you let them turn their backs on me like I was some kind of failure for falling in love with someone who actually treats me like I matter." His face hardened. "You don't understand the pressure they're under." "No," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't. Because I've been under pressure my whole life, Brandon. I carried this family on my back while you were out chasing whatever you wanted. And they loved you more for it." He didn't answer, just stood there blinking slowly like he couldn't recognize the woman in front of him. I walked away before I cried, left my cart full of groceries and drove home with shaking hands. That night I told Dylan everything, every word, every glance, every wound. He listened in silence as he always did. When I was done, he said softly, "You don't have to keep proving yourself to them, Jules. You already have." But I didn't feel like I had. Not yet. The night before the wedding, I stayed up alone, going over place settings and napkin folds and guest lists for the 10th time, even though everything was already done. I just couldn't sleep. My stomach churned with equal parts joy and grief. At 2:17 a.m., my phone lit up. It was a message from my mom. Don't expect a gift. No context. No punctuation. No emotion. I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't even a surprise anymore. They didn't want to come. Fine. They didn't approve. Fine. But this small final jab was meant to remind me one last time. You don't deserve more. But the next morning, as I stood barefoot in my kitchen, coffee cold in my hand, something in me shifted. They may never love me the way I needed. They may never give me the big wedding or the applause or the father-daughter dance I used to dream about, but they didn't get to decide if I was worth celebrating. I did. So I slipped into my dress, pulled my hair into a soft braid, let Dylan see me in my gown for the first time in our tiny bedroom. His eyes filled with tears. You look like every reason I believe in good things, he said. And that was my moment. No stage, no chandeliers, no string quartet, just love. And that was enough to carry me into what came next. But the pain didn't fade after the vows. It festered, quietly, like something waiting for a reckoning. And that reckoning was coming. They say your wedding day is supposed to be the happiest day of your life. I smiled in photos. I laughed with guests. I kissed Dylan like I wasn't carrying a crater in my chest. But deep down, I felt hollow. There were beautiful moments, of course. How could there not be? Dylan's aunt surprised us by arranging wildflower bouquets from her own garden. My best friend Anna gave a toast so heartfelt it had every woman at the table wiping their eyes. Dylan's niece, the one I used to teach, ran up and hugged me mid-ceremony, whispering, "You look like a queen." We ate potluck-style food made by people who loved us. Barbecue ribs, mac and cheese, bonzeo that Anna's mom dropped off with a kiss on my cheek. Everything was homegrown, homemade, and humbling in the best way. And yet, when the music faded and the guests trickled away, when Dylan and I stood under the cottonwood trees with dusk settling around us, I felt a lump in my throat. I couldn't swallow. No parents, no siblings, not even a card. Not even a single call or text saying, "We hope it went well." I tried to pretend it didn't matter. I told myself their absence was a gift. It freed me from their judgment. I told myself I was building a new family, one rooted in real love. But that night, when I lay next to Dylan in the tiny Airbnb above a garage our friends had let us borrow for the weekend, I broke, not with wailing or sobs, just a quiet, shaking grief I'd buried too long. I just wanted them to care, I whispered into the dark. Not even about the money. I didn't need that. I just wanted to be their daughter again. Dylan reached for my hand. You are. No, I said, and the word hurt. Not in the way that counts. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then they don't get to decide that anymore. That's what this day was about. Choosing who shows up for you. And letting go of the ones who won't. I knew he was right. I just wasn't ready to let go yet. The days after the wedding were the hardest. There was no honeymoon, just 2 days off work, and then straight back into the classroom where kids asked questions like, "Did you wear a big dress and did your mom cry?" And I had to smile and nod and lie, because how do you explain abandonment to a 5th grader? Dylan went back to the garage, back to scraped knuckles and oil stains, pretending not to notice when I stared off in silence while folding laundry or stirring pasta. But he noticed. He always noticed. And he tried. God, he tried. He left me little notes. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me." He surprised me with Vietnamese iced coffee from my favorite hole in the wall. He started humming our wedding song when I looked too sad. But there's only so much another person can carry for you. The text from my mom stayed on my phone for weeks. Don't expect a gift. It became a symbol, a wound I kept touching like a loose tooth. Sometimes I would open it just to stare, as if I could read it enough times to make it mean something else. Like, maybe it was sarcasm. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe she had been waiting for me to respond, to grovel, to beg, and then she would give in. But no. My dad never followed up. Brandon never called. My aunt sent a Facebook message. Your mom was really disappointed you didn't include her more in the planning. I stared at the message for 5 minutes before closing it. How do you include people who decided not to see you? I started avoiding family altogether. I didn't go to Sunday dinners. I ignored my cousin's baby shower invite. I skipped the annual Lunar New Year celebration that year and spent it eating frozen spring rolls on the couch with Dylan while pretending it didn't matter. But it did. I felt like a ghost in my own family, like I'd died and no one had noticed. One afternoon, I came home from work and found Dylan sitting on the porch holding something in his hands. A small white envelope, no stamp, no return address. It had been slid under our door. What is it? I asked. He handed it to me silently. Inside was a printed invitation Vanessa and Brandon's gender reveal party pink and blue balloons. Matching shirts, RSVP by next week. I stared at it stunned. They sent this, I asked. He nodded, dropped it off. His car was out front when I got home. I waited for a note, a message, anything to explain why, after ignoring our wedding, they suddenly wanted us at this. Nothing. That night, I sat at our kitchen table and looked at the invitation for a long, long time. The date circled in pink, the little poem about bows or arrows, the smiling photos of Brandon kissing Vanessa's belly. And then I cried, deep, aching sobs that came from a place I hadn't reached in years, because in that moment, I knew something with absolute clarity. I wasn't part of this family anymore. Not really. Not in the ways that mattered, and for the first time in my life, I stopped trying to be. After the gender reveal invitation, I fell into a fog. It wasn't depression in the way people usually imagine it, no days spent curled in bed, no skipping work or forgetting to eat. It was quieter than that, heavier, like I was carrying a stone in my chest that no one else could see. I went to work. I smiled at my students. I graded spelling tests, sat through staff meetings, made jokes with the other teachers in the break room. I did all the things a functioning adult is supposed to do. But at home, I unraveled in small ways. The dishes stayed in the sink longer. I stopped watering the herbs on the windowsill. I ignored texts from friends asking when we were going to celebrate with a post-wedding brunch. I even snapped at Dylan one night, really snapped because he'd forgotten to buy the oat milk I liked. He stood there with groceries in his hands, wide-eyed and confused, and I hated myself for how fast I'd turned cold. I muttered an apology and disappeared into the bathroom before he could say anything. Inside, I looked at myself in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. She looked tired, not physically, emotionally, like someone who had spent too long trying to earn something that would never come. That night, I deleted the gender reveal invite from my calendar. I didn't RSVP. I didn't text Brandon or Vanessa or anyone in my family. I knew what would happen. They'd call me selfish, dramatic, ungrateful, but I didn't care. I was done performing politeness for people who had made me invisible, and yet even that didn't bring relief. It only created more distance. 2 weeks later, I got a text from my aunt. "Why didn't you show up to Brandon's party?" Your mom cried. "You could have at least sent a gift." A gift. The word triggered something I didn't know was still raw. I wanted to reply, "Did she cry at my wedding? Did she even look at our pictures?" But I didn't. I didn't answer at all. Instead, I opened my laptop and scrolled through the wedding folder we had made hundreds of pictures of Dylan and me under the cottonwoods, smiling, dancing, laughing. In one of them, I was leaning back in his arms, the sun haloing behind my head like something holy. I looked happy. It struck me like lightning. That joy was real, even without them, especially without them. But grief doesn't obey logic. I began to question my own memories. Had I imagined the love that day? Had I forced the happiness to cover the pain? Was I just pretending everything was okay because I was too afraid to admit that it wasn't? One Sunday afternoon, I stood at the stove making chow ga, the same rice porridge my mom used to make when I was sick. It had been raining, and Dylan was under the carport working on a friend's pickup. I stirred the pot and suddenly found myself crying over the steam. The smell of ginger and scallions took me back to childhood, sitting at the kitchen table with scraped knees, watching my mom ladle out bowls with her careful hands. I hadn't thought of her hands in a long time. It hit me all at once. I missed her. I missed all of them. Not the versions they became, not the ones who judged Dylan or ignored my wedding or sent silent messages through other people. I missed the simpler memories, the before. But the truth was, those memories had always existed alongside the wounds. The love I felt growing up was always tangled with conditions. Praise came only after perfection. Warmth came only when I fit the mold. And now that I had stepped outside that mold, chosen my own partner, built my own life, they had closed the door on me. It hurt. It hurt in ways I didn't know how to talk about. Because what do you say when your greatest heartbreak isn't a failed romance, but a family that decided you were unworthy of celebration? Dylan noticed. Of course he noticed. One night after another dinner in silence, he cleared his throat and said, "Jules, do you want to talk to someone like a therapist or something?" I bristled at first. "I'm not broken. I didn't say you were." He looked at me with so much gentleness I wanted to cry again. "I just think you've been carrying this for a long time. And maybe you don't have to carry it alone anymore." I didn't answer, but that night I searched for therapists in the area. Just to see. Just to imagine what it would be like to finally let someone see the mess inside me. A week later, I sat in a soft-lit office across from a woman named Ellen with salt and pepper hair and eyes that didn't blink too fast when I told her the truth. I got married and my parents didn't show up. My brother ignored me. And I keep wondering if I did something to deserve it. She didn't say, "That's awful," or "You poor thing." She just nodded and said, "That kind of pain can feel like abandonment layered on top of invisibility." I'd never heard it phrased that way before. Abandonment layered on invisibility, and it was exactly right. For the first time, I let someone hold that truth with me, and it was the smallest beginning of something new. Not healing, not yet, but awareness, a seed planted in the soil of my sadness, a flicker of possibility that maybe, just maybe, I could write a different story for myself. Therapy didn't fix everything, but it gave me language. That was the first gift naming things I had spent years avoiding. Words like enmeshment, conditional love, emotional scapegoating. Ellen never pushed, never judged. She just handed me terms like flashlights and let me decide if I wanted to shine them into the dark corners of my life. I began to understand that I hadn't been rejected for who I was. I had been rejected for refusing to play the part I was assigned. In our sessions, I explored what it meant to grow up as the strong one. The one who didn't need help, who didn't ask for it, who always picked up the emotional slack so everyone else could fall apart. I learned that being strong often means being neglected, that in families like mine, strength is rewarded with silence. Compliance is mistaken for resilience. But the most painful realization I had mistaken being useful for being loved. Every memory I thought was love, cooking dinner for the family when I was 12, translating legal forms for my dad when I was in high school, driving Brandon to his SATs, those were acts of service, not affection. And I kept doing them because deep down I thought that maybe this time it will be enough. Maybe this time they'll look at me with the pride they give Brandon so easily. Maybe this time they'll tell me I matter. They never did. In one session, Ellen asked what would it look like to stop trying to earn their love. I didn't have an answer. The question felt like it cracked my bones open. That night, I sat at our tiny dining table staring at a stack of thank you cards I had been meaning to send. We had written dozens to friends, coworkers, distant relatives who mailed checks and kind notes for our wedding. I had been putting off writing one more. To my parents, even though they gave us nothing. Even though they didn't show up. Some small part of me still thought I should include them. That it would make me the bigger person. That it would prove something. But I stopped myself. What was I thanking them for? The silence. The judgment. I tore the blank card in half and threw it in the trash. It felt small, petty, and also freeing. That weekend, Dylan and I went on a hike in the Tahoe National Forest. It was something we hadn't done in a while. Life had gotten too heavy. We packed sandwiches, brought a thermos of iced tea, and walked until the trees swallowed the road noise. There, under the pines, I let myself breathe. We reached a lookout point where the land stretched for miles, green and untouched clouds dragging shadows over the hills. I stood in silence, letting the wind tug at my hair, and realized something I hadn't been ready to say aloud until that moment. I had survived the worst part. The wedding, the rejection, the aftermath. And I was still standing, still married to a man who loved me, still showing up for a classroom full of kids who believed in me, still capable of building something beautiful from the ruins. Dylan came up behind me and slipped his arms around my waist. "You're quieter than usual," he murmured. "I'm thinking." About what I turned, leaned into his shoulder, and said what it would mean to stop looking backward. He kissed my temple. "You don't have to forget it. Just don't let it own you." That's when I had the idea. A small one at first, a whisper in the back of my mind. What if I wrote about it not as revenge, not to shame my family, but for me? What if I gave shape to this pain, not to hold on to it, but to finally let it go? That night back home, I opened my laptop and created a blog. I didn't tell anyone. I chose a simple, clean layout, gave it a name that felt both personal and universal: The Ungifted Daughter. I wrote the first post in a single sitting. It started with my brother got $25,000 for his wedding. I got a text that said, "Don't expect a gift." And from there, I told the story. Not the polished version I'd repeated to friends, not the polite version I told coworkers. The raw truth, the ache behind the photos, the deep well of longing that came from being seen but not loved. I didn't think anyone would read it. I didn't need them to. But the next morning, I checked and saw the post had 3 comments. By the end of the week, it had 200. Women from across the country wrote back. Vietnamese-Americans, first-generation daughters, teachers, brides, sisters, all of them saying me too. Some were angry, some were grieving, some had healed already and offered their wisdom like tiny lanterns for the rest of us. I cried reading their messages. For the first time, I wasn't alone, and I began to wonder if so many of us felt unseen in our own families. Maybe we could start seeing each other. The blog became my quiet revolution. Every Sunday night after dinner and dishes, I'd sit down with a cup of chamomile tea, open my laptop, and write. I didn't overthink it. I didn't try to be eloquent. I just told the truth. Each post was like releasing a stone from my chest. The Invisible Sister, about growing up in the shadow of Brandon's mediocrity while being praised only for being useful. When they didn't show up, detailing the ache of waiting on the wedding day, staring at my phone, hoping for a message that never came. The Myth of the Strong Daughter. The piece that unexpectedly went viral shared over 30,000 times within 2 weeks. I didn't expect what followed. Emails flooded in hundreds, then thousands from women across the world. Teachers in Georgia, nurses in Toronto, software engineers in Seoul, all of them carrying their own versions of the same pain. I raised my brother after school while my mom worked, and he still gets treated like a prince. My parents gave my sister $40,000 for her wedding. I eloped, and they told me I'd brought shame. I thought I was the only one. Over and over again, I thought I was the only one. It cracked something wide open inside me. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was generational. This was cultural. This was buried in centuries of quiet expectations placed on daughters to be silent, sacrificial, and strong no matter the cost. Some of the messages made me cry. Some made me angry. All of them made me feel seen in a way my own family never had. I didn't respond to every message I couldn't, but I carried each one with me. Eventually, small opportunities started to find their way to me. A woman from a nonprofit that supported first-gen daughters in immigrant households invited me to speak on a podcast. I almost said no. I was still shaking off the part of me that said I wasn't important enough to speak out loud. But Dylan encouraged me. "You have something to say," he said. "You always have." They just never wanted to listen. So I said yes. On the podcast, I told the story the real one. No sugarcoating, just honesty. I thought I would feel exposed. But instead, I felt strong, not angry, not bitter, just clear, like I was finally choosing my own voice over the echo of my parents' disapproval. After the episode aired, I got an email from someone I hadn't expected to hear from. Vanessa, Brandon's wife. It was short. "Hi, Julia. I listened to your podcast. I didn't know it was this bad. I'm so sorry for everything you went through. I don't know what to say except that you didn't deserve any of it. If you ever want to talk, I'm here." I stared at the email for a long time. My hands shook. I hadn't blamed Vanessa directly, but I had assumed she was complicit. She'd accepted the gifts, the Rolex, the praise, the inheritance of favoritism. But now I wondered if she'd just been another woman caught in the same storm, unaware of how deep the roots of our family's imbalance ran. I didn't reply right away. I needed time. But I didn't delete it either. Around the same time, Ellen, my therapist, asked me a question that stopped me in my tracks. "Julia, what does healing actually look like for you?" I sat with that for days. I realized I'd spent so long surviving, proving, mourning. I hadn't pictured what after looked like, what peace might mean. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't forcing my parents to understand. It wasn't getting an apology from Brandon. It was this waking up and not checking my phone for their approval, building something with Dylan that felt rooted and unshakable, telling the truth, my truth, without fear, letting go of the hope that they would ever become someone they're not. That was the hardest part. Letting go of the hope. But once I did, I felt lighter. Dylan noticed the change first. "You laugh more now," he said one evening as we watched reruns on the couch legs tangled popcorn between us. "Your eyes don't look so tired." He was right. I was laughing again. And not the performative kind, the real kind that bubbles out of your chest when you're safe, when you no longer feel like you're waiting to be loved. We took a weekend trip to Monterey just because. No anniversaries, no big reasons. Just the two of us, a tiny rented cabin sea breeze, and a kitchen stocked with cheap wine and better intentions. One night over dinner, Dylan asked, "Do you still think about them a lot?" I paused. "Yes, but not in the same way." He nodded. "You think they'll ever come around?" I shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not." And then I added something I hadn't said before. "I don't need them to anymore." He smiled, took my hand. That moment felt like the closing of a chapter, but not the end of the story. Because healing isn't a finish line, it's a choice. 1,000 small choices to stop shrinking, to stop begging, to stop bleeding for people who only ever wanted your silence. And I was ready to choose something new. It had been nearly 9 months since the wedding when my phone lit up with a name I hadn't seen on my screen in almost a year. Brandon. I froze. The world around me, my steaming cup of tea, the chirping of birds outside the hum of the dryer in the hallway, suddenly faded. The last time we'd spoken was in that grocery store aisle where I left him blinking under fluorescent lights, a carton of frozen dumplings melting in his hand. And now, after everything, he was calling. For a moment, I thought about letting it go to voicemail, pretending I hadn't seen it, moving on just like I had told myself I was doing. But something in me stirred not out of hope, but from readiness. I picked up. "Hello, Julia," Brandon said, his voice quieter than I remembered. "Hey." There was a pause. Not awkward, just full of things unspoken. "I wasn't sure you'd answer," he added. "I almost didn't." "Yeah." "I get it." He sighed, and I could hear movement in the background. "A crying baby." His voice softened when he said, "We had a girl. Her name's Leona." I blinked. A girl. The first feeling was nothing. No anger, no joy, just numbness. Then a slow ache crept in, the kind that only comes from being excluded from something you once would have dropped everything to celebrate. "Congratulations," I said. "She's lucky to have you." "I don't know about that," he replied. "But I wanted to tell you myself." Another pause. Then he added, "Vanessa showed me your blog. I read it all." My breath caught. He continued, "It was hard to read, not because it wasn't true, but because I never saw it that way. I always thought you were just stronger, that you didn't need anything from them or me. My throat tightened. That's the thing, I said quietly. Being strong isn't the same as not needing love. I know that now, he said. I should have said something. I should have stood up for you. I'm sorry, Jules. It didn't fix everything. But it cracked a window open. We talked for an hour about Leona, about Dylan, about the way things used to be. He didn't make excuses. He didn't defend our parents. He just listened and owned his part. When the call ended, I stared at my phone for a long time. I hadn't expected that. I hadn't needed it. But it felt like a strange sort of peace. Not closure, but truth. A week later, another unexpected message came. From my mom. Just 3 words. Can we talk? I didn't reply right away. For 3 days, I let it sit there, a blinking notification that felt like a trap. I reread old texts, reopened old wounds in my mind. Then I talked to Ellen about it. Do you want to talk to her? She asked. I don't know. Not do you owe her. Not will it make her feel better. Do you want to? I sat with that. And then I realized I did. Not to fix things, not to beg for love, but to speak plainly for once in my life. We met at a cafe halfway between our houses, neutral territory. She arrived 10 minutes late, dressed in a neat cardigan, her hair pinned back like always. She looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe I was just seeing her differently now. Hi, Con, she said, offering a tentative smile. I nodded. Hi. We ordered coffee, sat in silence for a moment. Then she said, I read your blog. All of it. I stiffened. I didn't know you were hurting like that. She continued, you always looked capable, like you didn't need us. I did, I said softly. I needed you on my wedding day. I needed you when you told Brandon he was a gift and told me to do better. I needed you to show up. Not with money, just as my mother. She looked down. I thought we were protecting you. I thought if we were harder on you, you'd go further. And what did you think would happen when I stopped playing along? I asked. That I'd just disappear. Tears welled in her eyes. I didn't think. I was scared. I paused, of what she hesitated, then said, of losing you to a life we didn't understand. Dylan. He's not what I pictured, but I see now that's not what matters. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small wrapped box. I know this doesn't fix anything, she said, but this was supposed to be for you, for your wedding. I didn't give it because I was being stubborn and proud and wrong. I opened the box. Inside was a delicate gold chain. Simple. Elegant. I remembered seeing it in her drawer when I was little, tucked into tissue paper. She used to say she was saving it for a special day. This is the first thing I bought for myself when we came to America, she said. I was going to give it to you on your wedding day. I'm sorry it's late. I touched the chain. It was warm from her hands, heavy with the weight of years. I didn't say, it's okay, because it wasn't. But I said, thank you. And that was enough for now. We talked for another hour. Not everything was solved. Not every wound was closed. But the conversation happened. And that mattered. When I walked back to my car, I felt something lift, a burden I hadn't even realized I was still carrying. I wasn't chasing approval anymore. I had faced them, spoken the truth, kept my boundaries, and I was still whole. Still me. Only lighter. Spring returned before I realized it. One morning as I stepped out to my car, I noticed the first blush of cherry blossoms on the neighbor's tree. The air was warmer, softer, as if the earth had decided to loosen its grip and let things bloom again. It had been a year since the wedding, a full year since the text, "Don't expect a gift," a year since I felt like a discarded daughter. And yet now, I stood in that same driveway, wearing the gold chain my mother had finally given me, sipping coffee that Dylan made with that goofy foam heart on top, and I felt different. Not healed in the fairy tale sense, but whole. Somewhere in the months between grief and now, I had quietly rebuilt myself, not as someone who fit into a role her family approved of, but as someone who made space for her own damn joy. It showed up in small ways. I laughed without guilt. I wore the lipstick shade my mom always said was too loud. I invited friends over for dinner without waiting for a holiday. I stopped second-guessing every text I sent to my brother. If he responded, fine. If not, I no longer tied my worth to it. And the blog. It grew beyond anything I imagined. Readers shared it in newsletters, teachers printed posts for their daughters, a local magazine asked to feature one of the essays. I received a message from a young Vietnamese woman in Michigan who said, "Your words made me feel like I had an older sister for the first time." That one made me cry, because I had spent so much time grieving what I didn't get as a sister-daughter woman. But now I was beginning to see what I could become for someone else. Dylan and I planned a small anniversary picnic, just the two of us. No matching tablecloths or fancy photos. Just sandwiches, old blankets, and the field behind his aunt's property where we'd once said I do under cottonwood trees. As we sat under the blue sky barefoot and full of cold lemonade and laughter, Dylan looked at me and said, "Do you regret how it all happened?" I thought for a moment. Then I said, "Sometimes, but then I remember what came from it." What came from it? I looked around, the sun on his skin, the field, the blog, the readers, the peace in my chest. Me, I said. I came from it. He smiled. "That's the best gift you've ever given me." I took his hand, squeezed it, and smiled back. Later that week, I posted one final blog entry titled "A Different Kind of Inheritance." I wrote I used to think a gift had to come in a box, a check, a piece of jewelry, a place at the table. But now I know the most important gifts we receive are the ones we give ourselves. The gift of voice, of boundaries, of walking away, of loving ourselves harder than anyone else ever could. My brother got $25,000. I got a text, but in the end I got my freedom, my husband, my truth. And I wouldn't trade that for all the checks in the world. I clicked publish, closed the laptop, and walked outside into the sunlight. No approval needed, no permission asked. Just me finally gloriously unwrapped and whole.